Hi, I'm Laura Mooiman. I'm so glad to be part of RJWorld 2020. Though I have to admit, I'm sad we can't all be together in person. I'm actually talking to you from The Hague. I moved to the Netherlands a year and a half ago after I left my job as a school district administrator in California, and now I'm an educational consultant and a trainer in the area of restorative practices and positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS. So now I work with schools all around the world to improve school culture and climate, to improve student behavior, and to create safe, positive, and restorative schools. In this session, I wanted to talk about how to integrate PBIS and restorative practices in schools. We'll start first with understanding how America got here. Why do kids misbehave, and why hasn't our traditional discipline system worked? I'll offer a solution to schools that will integrate two of the most widely used school climate and behavior programs in the world, PBIS and restorative practices. So on their own, each of these programs shape school culture, and in unison, they create a long-lasting, sustainable school transformation. You'll find support materials attached with some action items you can complete with your school that'll help you get started on implementing PBIS and restorative practices. So let's get started. I remember hiding in the bathroom stalls during recess in the first grade. There was this girl in my class named Tina, and she always came to school in grubby clothes, and she had brown smudges on her neck and on her hands. And one day our teacher, Mrs. McClure, she grabbed her arm and she yelled, "Did you kick Donovan? Your father told me I could spank you if I needed to." And then Mrs. McClure took a swing and smacked Tina on the bottom so hard that her feet flew up in the air, and I remember her red hair flying around. Years later, I ran into Tina, and she told me that back then her mom had just left her dad, and he used to lock her in the attic when she misbehaved. He could barely manage, and so he gave the teachers permission to spank her at school, which was still legal in the 1970s. And by the way, it is still legal in 19 states in the US. I just remember feeling so small and powerless when I was at school. And I was born into what might be called privilege and opportunity. I like how civil rights activist Tilly Olson called it. She said it was the soil of easy growth. I was a white middle-class daughter, history teacher father, a stay-at-home mom in Fresno, California. My father marched with Dr. King when he came to Fresno in 1964, and as a kid, I remember watching Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth documentaries. I grew up believing in justice, that I had personal value, that girls could do anything boys could do. Adults were fair and caring. And this changed when I started school. It was really scary and unpredictable and unkind. So I guess becoming a social worker appealed to the social justice streak in me, and my focus on school allowed me to see justice happen in a setting where I didn't personally experience it. So I spent years as a counselor in group homes and non-public schools with emotionally and behaviorally disabled kids. And I figured when you learn how to help a kid sit in a desk instead of eating quarters and potting soil, you start to appreciate the incredible strengths that most public school students bring with them. After getting my master's in social work at UCLA, I worked for county probation. I was a child crisis worker for county mental health, and I was a caseworker for the Department of Children and Family Services in Los Angeles. I remember going on home visits in gang territory in LA, and I learned how to spot flecks of shiny metal in the carpet from the burning of crack cocaine. I'll never forget, though, my first day as a school social worker. It was in Los Angeles, and when I walked into the cafeteria, just the smell made me sick to my stomach, and all of those feelings about school came flooding back. And to make it worse, it was the late 90s, the years of the Gun-Free Schools Act and zero tolerance policies, so there were metal detectors and razor wire around the school. When I'd get to work, there were usually cop cars pulled up on the curb. I remember one day at a high school that I worked at, a student had brought a gun in his backpack and it went off during class. Over the next 12 years, I was a school social worker in 9 different districts and 2 different states, and I loved it. I loved helping kids overcome behavioral and emotional barriers to school, making school a better place for kids and for teachers. And most recently, I worked in Napa Valley Unified School District, which has about 18,000 students and 30 schools. And for 10 years, I was the school district administrator responsible for implementing PBIS Restorative Practices, social emotional learning, and then student mental health programming. We built wellness centers there. When we started PBIS, students were missing over 5,000 days of school a year due to suspensions. And we were expelling so many students from our school district that one school board member told me I was starting to wonder if we'd have any students left. So the school board became one of the first to pass a positive school climate board policy in the state of California, and actually in the nation. It required all 30 schools to implement PBIS, social emotional learning program, and restorative practices. After just 2 years of implementing PBIS, we cut our suspensions in half. And then, as we began to integrate restorative practices, we reduced suspensions even further because we're able to make meaningful and deep connections with students and then really focus on changing behavior through accountability and dialogue. At the same time, we began to see juvenile arrests drop so dramatically in the city of Napa that I started to hear rumors that half of juvenile hall was closed. At the end of my 10 years there, we had reduced suspensions by 75%, expulsions by 99%, and every year we saved over $250,000 by keeping kids in school. In California, schools are funded by an average daily attendance. Our district was recognized by the California State Superintendent for having one of the most significant declines in suspensions and expulsions, and at the same time, we earned some of the highest school climate scores in the state. School climate surveys measure things like caring relationships, safety, violence, bullying, school connectedness. And it wasn't just one or two schools, it was all of them. All 30 schools scored between the 97th and 99th percentile in the state of California year after year. So I'll tell you, it's one thing to do a program for a year or two, go a mile wide and an inch deep. It's a whole other thing to implement in deep and long-lasting ways, to change people's habits and hearts, to go a mile wide and a mile deep. I want to teach you how to do that for your students, for your schools. We need to make school a better place for all children, but especially those like Tina. Every kid should be in a predictable, safe setting where they're treated with dignity and respect and where someone believes in them. Let's start at the beginning. Why do kids misbehave? Well, we know that about 10% of students have conduct problems and about 17% of kids have mental health issues like anxiety, depression, ADHD. And only 8% of students account for most of office discipline referrals in a school. Statistically speaking, in a classroom of 30 students, there should be 3 kids that drive you absolutely crazy and about 5 kids with depression, anxiety, ADHD, and then there's some overlap between those kids. So if we know this, why is it that every year we act so surprised? Why don't we make a plan? And why is it that so many kids have such challenging behavior, and what can we do about it? Many of you have heard about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, the research from Dr. Vince Felitti in the 1990s. He was a physician and a chief of Kaiser Permanente's preventative medicine department in San Diego. He was working in the obesity clinic at the time, and he was trying to figure out if there were certain traumatic events that could happen in a child's life that could lead to chronic diseases. And he studied medical records and interviewed over 17,000 average Americans who had health insurance and narrowed it down to 10 childhood traumas, what he called adverse childhood experiences that led to really negative outcomes. Not just chronic diseases, but also mental illness, more broken bones, more drug prescriptions, more marriages, employment problems like absenteeism, and even going to prison. He also found that if a person had one traumatic event or one ACE, there was an 87% chance that they had even more. For example, a person who had an alcoholic father was also likely to have experienced physical abuse. So in other words, ACEs usually didn't happen in isolation. So how does this play out in a school setting? So this is a risk path. And let's say we have a child, we'll call her Tina, who's about to experience some of the risk factors that Felitti identified. There are 10. They're physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, a mentally ill or alcoholic parent, domestic violence, a family member who's been incarcerated, and losing a parent through divorce or abandonment. So Tina starts to develop some short-term negative outcomes like being defiant, because adults can't be trusted, lack of school readiness, coercive interaction styles like being manipulative because the only way to get mom's attention when she's passed out on the couch in an alcoholic stupor is to hit her little brother. And so she brings that problem-solving skill to school where it doesn't go over very well. The maladaptive behaviors she's developing include truancy, because she doesn't think you like her and she doesn't like you. Lots of discipline referrals, so she moves around a lot, she attends a lot of different schools, she gets involved with drugs and alcohol at an early age, maybe she's even arrested. And then comes destructive long-term outcomes like school failure and dropout, drug and alcohol use, independence, gang membership, violence, adult criminality, dependence on the welfare system, more injuries, more depression. In fact, the more ACEs that Tina has, the higher her risk. Things start getting really serious around an ACE score of 4. People with 4 or more are twice as likely to smoke, 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic, and 12 more times likely to have attempted suicide. If someone has more than 6, their lifespan is shorter by 20 years. The severe and chronic stress of childhood trauma releases hormones that physically damage a child's developing brain. This is how pediatrician Nadine Burke-Harris describes it. If you're in a forest and you see a bear, a very efficient fight or flight system instantly floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol and shuts off the thinking portion of your brain that would stop to consider other options. This is very helpful if you're in a forest and you need to run from a bear. The problem is when that bear comes home from the bar every night. If you're into neurology, the release of the stress hormone cortisol impacts the limbic system, the learning center of the brain, which includes the prefrontal cortex that's involved in self-regulation and planning, the hippocampus, which helps with learning and memory, and then the amygdala, which is the emotional center. So a lot of kids are coming to school unable to learn because they're trapped in this fight or flight stress response because of what they're exposed to in their lives. But there is hope. Just as there's the neurobiology of stress, there's also the neurobiology of trust, relationships, and connection. It's mediated by this hormonal cascade called the oxytocin cascade, the love hormone. So one of the most important things about oxytocin is that it opposes cortisol. Relationships filled with trust are the antidote to the experience of stress. In other words, children's brains develop in response to relationships in an environment that we expose them to. If our school setting is calm and supportive because we're predictable, consistent, we have safe relationships, we can actually help heal a child's brain. Now, when kids misbehave, instead of teaching new behaviors and providing more support, many schools using traditional school discipline methods will exclude them from the classroom, send them into the hallway or to the office, or even suspend them from school. So these exclusionary discipline tactics, they break relationships when we need to be creating them. The path of traditional school discipline is not working. So how did we get here and what are the solutions? I think, honestly, one of the most monumental changes in schools was the passage of the Gun-Free Schools Act. In 1994, lawmakers decided it would be a really good idea to tell students they couldn't bring guns to school. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But what the lawmakers did is they made school behavior punishable in court. So in my generation, behavior that earned a phone call home to our parents became an actual crime. And kids began to be suspended, expelled, and even arrested right from school. We created what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. Suspensions and expulsions, exclusionary discipline, it used to be pretty rare in the 70s and 80s, but it exploded in the 90s. And what was weird was that less than 10% of the time, these suspensions and expulsions were for weapons. Even stranger is schools in rural areas and small towns, they were suspending kids at 5 and 6 times the rates of big urban cities like Chicago and San Francisco. And just a few years after passing the Gun-Free Schools Act, we had Columbine in April of 1999. Zero tolerance policies didn't make schools safer. When schools created zero tolerance policies, they believed they had solid rationale for using sanctions and punishments in schools. We need to punish wrongdoing. We need to make an example of the kids, or all the other kids will think it's okay. We need to remove students who are unsafe. And in the short term, it appeared to work. We put all the responsibility for change on the kid and on their family, and the student was gone, so we felt relief. But the relief that sets in when a student's removed from a classroom or from the school, it vanishes when they come back with the same challenging behavior. Often it's even worse because office referrals and suspensions, they don't teach new expected behaviors. They break relationships that the students already had with the school community. The student misses instruction, so they fall farther behind, and then when they're not engaged in class, they fall farther behind, and then they act out more, and then they're sent out again, and relationships between students and staff deteriorate. Studies started showing reduced motivation in these students to maintain self-control and an increase in youth anger. Academic achievement was weakening, and research was showing a correlation between schools that were highly punitive. They had high rates of detention, suspensions, and expulsions. They also had the highest rates of truancy, dropout, vandalism, and aggression. So by the time I arrived at work in Long Beach, California in 1999, I had to pass through a metal detector and razor wire to get to my office. Well, we know that these changes in schools, they were accompanied by a lot of other social, economic, political changes in the U.S. We can't say that the schools have helped matters. Schools are contributing to the negative outcomes that Felity was talking about. Alienation, school failure, delinquency, dropout, mental health problems, and even substance abuse. There's another way, a better way. Research studies explain the problem, but they also offer solutions. We know that calm, predictable settings make kids feel safe so they can learn. We know that trusting relationships can actually heal the brain. We know through resiliency research that one factor above nearly all of the others that helps a person overcome traumatic events while other people are defeated by them is having one positive adult in their life who believes in them, mentors them, who's there for them. And while this person could be a grandparent or a coach or a youth pastor, as luck would have it, research shows that in most cases, this person is a teacher or another caring adult at the child's school. When we talk about positive behavior interventions and supports, we're not talking about giving out little paper tickets. And when we talk about restorative practices, we're not talking about just sitting in a circle and singing Kumbaya. We're talking about saving kids' lives. We need to start using research so we can do things that actually have a chance to change the student's behavior and not just perpetuate harm. Now I want to talk about two of the most promising solutions, which are broadly utilized in schools all over the world. Positive behavior interventions and supports, PBIS, and restorative practices. And the good news is that you don't have to choose between them. You need both because they complement each other and they can be integrated seamlessly. So let's start by looking at PBIS. The first time I heard about PBIS, I was sitting in a conference room in Colorado in the early 2000s, and I was listening to a keynote address. The more he talked, the more enthralled I became. Literally, I was leaning forward. He was describing my life in schools. He said, there are more of them than there are of us. The only real change comes from the entire school environment and cannot be one child at a time. At the time, I was a school social worker, mainly working with students in special education with pretty significant behavior and mental health issues. And I'd pull a few kids at a time from class and do individual or group counseling, skills teaching, to address their crazy behaviors of knocking over desks and hitting their peers and shouting and running out of class. The kids were great with me, but when I'd take them back to class, they'd fall apart. At the time, Rob was working with a handful of researchers like Jeff Sprague, George Sugai, Rob Horner from the University of Oregon's Special Education Department. They'd been working on school behavior for decades, but in the 90s, their work started to get more attention from schools all over the nation as a way to solve these problems that the schools were seeing with student behavior and school climate. They were studying what works in school and classroom discipline. What were the safest schools? Where were the best classrooms? What did they all have in common? And what they came up with was basically a list of what to do. Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, PBIS, it's not a program or a kit. It's actually a list of best practices that lead to safe, positive schools with happy kids and teachers. On this list are things like getting all the school staff on the same page in terms of behavior expectations and explicitly teaching those to the kids weekly, using evidence-based social-emotional learning programs that teach empathy, emotion management, problem solving, impulse control, having positive reinforcement systems like token economies, having frequent positive communication with families, excellent classroom management systems, having the work be team-driven, like a culture and climate team, and having the principal seen to be leading the work, responding to problem behavior early with quick, focused interventions like skills teaching, and having a tiered system of supports for students who are not responding to the universal strategies. The researchers borrowed from public health and created a tiered model of interventions in schools that we refer to as multi-tiered system of support, MTSS. Imagine your whole school community fitting into this pyramid. 80 to 90% of students typically respond to your Tier 1 school-wide efforts. You implement school-wide PBIS by developing explicit rules and expectations for every area of the school. You teach it to the students. You have a positive reinforcement system. You respond to misbehavior with reteaching. You have an evidence-based social-emotional learning curriculum. Most kids will flourish in this type of setting. However, there'll still be a few kids who continue to struggle and have conduct problems, social-emotional problems. They benefit from all the universal positive systems, but they need more. In Tier 2, which is generally about 10 to 15%, these students are supported by incorporating a self-management system, like a point sheet, check in, check out, to help them regulate throughout the day. They often benefit by participating in small groups like social skills instruction or anger management or other cognitive behavior support. They also may need some accommodations in the classroom, like extra time, output method, task size, increased teacher support. Students will benefit from all of these things, and there will still be very few, about 3 to 5%, who will need an even more structured support system. In Tier 3, now we're talking about functional behavior assessment, behavior plans, individualized counseling, wraparound supports, and so on. When we look at academics, we use the same MTSS model. A lot of schools make the mistake of starting by focusing on the kids who are causing the most problems. Something must be done. But as Rob Horner says, if you only focus on those with significant problems, it'll be twice as hard, twice as expensive, and much less likely to succeed. You want to lay the universal Tier 1 foundation first and build from there. You'll be surprised at the difference it makes in reducing overall behavior problems and increasing the consistency and calm on your campus. Now let's talk about what are restorative practices. Imagine a community sitting around a fire or a tree to talk about what happened, who was impacted, and how to make it right. Using circles for meeting and discussing issues, it's evolved in nearly every culture. It was the court of our ancestors, and it's how human beings solve problems in community. So back in the 1980s, there was this Australian police officer named Terry O'Connell, and he heard about the Maori tribe in New Zealand. He visited them and experienced their way of solving problems by having structured community meetings. And he saw this amazing accountability and healing that happened. Their way of solving problems, it was no less sophisticated, but it was much more effective than the retributive system we think of as justice today. He adapted the process, and the questions he created are what we now call restorative conferences. In 1994, Terry O'Connell spoke at a conference in Pennsylvania, and in the audience was a school administrator named Ted Wachtel. He was already doing a lot of what Terry was talking about, even though he didn't call it the same thing. He was so taken with O'Connell's work that he founded the International Institute on Restorative Practices, where they continue to provide training and leadership to schools, organizations, and even governments to this day. You'll learn about restorative processes and strategies which bring about accountability without blame and foster empathy without making excuses. These strategies include classroom circles, community building, instructional or problem solving, affective language, restorative chats, mediation, circles, and conferences, which are all simply structured conversations that build community, resolve conflict, and repair harm. Restorative practices increase social emotional skill development, decrease behavior problems. They provide a structure for when conflict and tension arise. And it also promotes social justice because we ask everyone the same questions, no matter if they get in trouble regularly or if this is the first time. And most importantly, restorative practices increases trusting relationships, which neurologically speaking are an antidote to stress for both students and teachers. As a pyramid is to PBIS, a restorative practices training could not be complete without the social discipline window. The window is a visual representation to illustrate 4 basic approaches to maintaining behavior in schools. There are different combinations of high or low control and high or low support. Starting at the bottom left, you see not neglect. This teacher has low control and low support. In this quadrant, the teacher is burned out. They talk about retirement at the lunch table, maybe vacation, but never school. Teaching is not for the faint of heart, and burnout is a real problem. But they don't have rules or guidelines, they have very low expectations, and they also have no consequences for behavior. In this classroom, students feel at best disengaged, but at worst maybe fearful because behavior is pretty out of control. And then as you move to the right, this teacher has low control, but high support. So they do things for students. They're permissive. Maybe they let students get away with stuff. And when students misbehave, they might make excuses and not hold the child accountable for their behavior. Maybe they plead or bargain with kids to behave. They have low expectations, they don't have clear rules, and the students seem to be in charge. Students in these classrooms, they're unmotivated, apathetic, disconnected. In a classroom like this, it's miserable. Often the teacher feels helpless to set boundaries, and instead they think the students can be free and creative when in fact it's complete chaos. Teachers and administrators in the 2 quadrant tend to be authoritarian and punitive. These are the people in the staff room demanding consequences for kids who do wrong. They reminisce about the good old days when kids could be suspended and expelled more easily. They use fear of punishment to control behavior. And students in these classrooms, they might comply, but some of them will rebel. Most kids feel frustrated, angry, and resentful. Now let's move to the upper right. High support and high control. This teacher does things with students rather than to or for them. They're restorative. They create norms and guidelines collaboratively. They have high expectations. They're consistent, clear, fair. Think PBIS. They're nurturing, encouraging, compassionate. They acknowledge positive behavior. In this classroom, students cooperate, they collaborate, they're creative. They even take responsibility for their actions. Students might describe this teacher as firm but fair, strict but fun. Our goal is to try to be in the with box as much as possible. When the chips are down and we're stressed, we tend to gravitate towards one of the other boxes. Maybe you slip into the 2 quadrant or maybe the 4 quadrant. That's normal. It's good to be aware so you can remind yourself to try to do things with students. Ted Wachtel, the founder of the International Institute of Restorative Practices, says the fundamental thesis underlying restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more productive, more cooperative, and more likely to make positive changes when those in authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So why are restorative practices so important? Why does it even work? The primary research base for restorative practices is found in social bonding and the neurobiological components of creating trusting relationships. So all of us are hardwired to connect with others. In the same way that we need food and shelter, even more so people need deep and meaningful relationships. Consider Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. All day long, teachers are asked to meet self-actualization needs of students so that they can meet their full potential. They can collaborate and be creative. Yet so many underlying needs aren't met. The bottom of the pyramid is a human's basic physiological need, like food and shelter and water. Next, we have safety needs. Students need to feel safe, physically and emotionally. There's order and predictability. Research shows that by implementing PBIS, your students will reliably report feeling safer on school climate surveys. Then we have belonging needs. Here is where restorative practices comes in. The classroom circle will bring a sense of belonging, not just between teachers and students, but also among the students. Have you ever wondered why your students will behave well for you, but not when a substitute teacher comes? One reason could be that the students belong to you. They want to behave for you, but they don't belong to each other. Circles create and strengthen community and relationships. They help students understand and care about how their behavior impacts others. Research has shown that relationships matter. Strong teacher-student relationships have been associated with high student academic engagement, improved attendance, higher grades, fewer disruptive behaviors, fewer suspensions, lower school dropout rates, decrease in teacher and student anxiety, and increase in teacher and student well-being. According to researcher John Hattie, when there's a positive teacher-student relationship, students feel safe and there's a strong bond of trust in the classroom. Students aren't afraid to take risks and they understand making mistakes is all part of learning. Students are more likely to feel positive about school and have a greater chance of developing a true love of learning that way. He says, it's teachers who have created positive teacher-student relationships that are more likely to have above-average effects on student achievement. We can't continue to expect teachers to bring their students into esteem and self-actualization without giving them the tools to get there. Restorative Practices offers these tools that support teachers and students to create belonging and to respond to conflict and harm. Research on schools implementing restorative practices has been significantly less than in the field of PBIS, but it is promising. When researchers looked at the classrooms where teachers used restorative practices like giving voice, facilitating circles, reintegrating students into class after misbehavior, these students reported much higher rates on positive school climate, feelings toward their teacher and peers, voice and input, higher connectedness to their school. They had better peer friendships, they developed more social skills, more empathetic, more assertive, and it even was associated with lower rates of cyberbullying. The number of days lost to suspension declined. And then it did some interesting things for equity. Racial and income disparities in suspension rates declined compared to controlled schools. And then the group of students whose suspensions reduced the most were African American low-income girls. In other words, not only did restorative practices improve the school climate and relationships, but restorative practices significantly improved equity in the discipline of the schools. I believe we need to integrate PBIS and restorative practices in order to create schools that are physically and emotionally safe, relationship-rich, and with the potential to support students in developing the skills that they're going to need to overcome effects of adversity and to learn. The first reason to blend the two approaches is frankly efficiency. With PBIS, most of your energy should be focused on preventing problems in the first place. You create clear expectations, you teach them to students, and you're incredibly positive. And often schools see a 60% drop in problem behavior in the first year. With PBIS, your results come fast. This will effectively shorten the line at the principal's door, so to speak. So you're going to have more time available to provide meaningful restorative responses to harm. If you don't first focus on preventing problem behavior, you're going to be quickly overwhelmed with all of the student needs for interventions and supports. Restorative practices is not something a school should embark on believing it's going to save time. If done correctly, it's time intensive, but the payoff is that often the problem behavior will not be repeated. The next reason to integrate PBIS and restorative practices is the understanding that students need trusting relationships in their school in order to learn. So trust is created when people in a child's environment are predictable and consistent, and PBIS provides that kind of structure. Trust also requires a warm and accepting environment, and restorative practices creates this through community building circles and restorative conversations. In other words, settings that have high control through the structures of PBIS and high support and warmth of community building circles will create these rich relationships where students can grow and thrive. Next, you also want to integrate them in order to create a more connected, positive school climate. Research is clear. The positive reinforcement systems embraced by PBIS, they do improve behavior and they create a lot of positive exchanges between students and teachers. Restorative practices goes further, creating this heart connection through relationship building. Another reason to integrate the two approaches is to respond to harm more meaningfully. So PBIS, it does an excellent job providing clear evidence-based interventions to students who need them, but it doesn't really have a way to respond to those who were harmed or to get to the heart of the issue to repair relationships that were damaged. Restorative practices helps those who were harmed by giving them voice and strength. While restorative practices offers responses that hope to change behavior through accountability, some students, like those with emotional and behavioral disorders, autism, and other disabilities, they need actual interventions that go beyond a circle or a conversation. PBIS offers evidence-based interventions to students who need them. It uses a tiered framework to teach the student new behaviors and strategies for self-management in a way that builds confidence and reduces shame. And finally, you need to integrate PBIS and restorative practices to sustain your school culture. One strength of PBIS is that it creates a system and a structure that, when lent to restorative practices, makes it more sustainable over time. PBIS is made sustainable by codifying what the rules and expectations are, writing them down, educating staff and students. The systems they use for positive reinforcement are written down. Behavioral consequence procedures, they're documented. Incoming staff and students are trained on these procedures, and the system lives on every year, regardless of staffing changes. A system that's a written framework and it's explicitly taught to staff and students, it's a sustainable system, which means restorative practices, when integrated with PBIS, become stronger and more sustainable. Blending PBIS and restorative practices is easier than you think. By integrating restorative practices into your school, you'll change the way you roll out PBIS. You'll approach it in a restorative frame so that it's more with and less to or for. For example, in a PBIS school, a few staff members might be tempted to sit in a room and decide on the school rules, or maybe choose the positive reinforcements they want to give. But when they approach it restoratively, they're going to involve all the staff and students in creating the classroom and school-wide expectations. They'll develop positive systems that the students actually want. When these systems aren't working, or maybe agreements are broken, schools can bring the issues back to the staff and the students to talk about what's happening. What do we need to do to fix it? In addition to changing the way we roll out PBIS, restorative practices also adds more tools to our existing structure of interventions and supports. By adding these restorative practices tools, it'll reduce misbehavior, office referrals, and suspensions, because it'll create ways to effectively respond to harm when it happens. A student who's harmed another person, student or staff, will meet face-to-face with that person and anyone else involved. Everyone can express how they were impacted and what they need to move forward. Agreements will be made, and then they move on. They heal. We simply integrate these restorative strategies into the multi-tiered system of support. At Tier 1, we incorporate classroom circles to build community and deliver academic instruction and even to problem solve. We use affective language, both statements and questions, to express how we're impacted by someone else's behavior without making people defensive, because we're going to focus on needs instead of blaming. At Tier 2, we may use some restorative conversations, like restorative chats. That's an informal, facilitated conversation using the restorative questions to solve problems. We use restorative mediation. That helps us resolve conflict between two people that's mutual. And restorative circles, also maybe called harm circles. That helps us respond to a problem when more people are involved and we want to hear what happened, who was affected, and how we need to repair the harm. At Tier 3, we have more formal conferences, a structured circle to repair significantly disruptive or harmful incidences with those who did the harm, those who were harmed, and other people who maybe were impacted by it. We also have reentry circles for when a student returns from suspension or even incarceration. As a result, restorative practices improves the school climate for students and staff because it provides meaningful ways to address misbehavior in schools, and it creates structures to build relationships and strengthen schools as communities. One of the best places to start when implementing PBIS and restorative practices is to select people to be on your team that's going to lead your efforts in implementing these changes. Some schools might call the team a Tier 1 team, or a PBIS Restorative Practices team, or a Culture and Climate team. It should be a representative group of people of about 5 to 10 teachers and staff. People from different grade levels, subject areas, special education, also staff members like campus supervisors, counselors, social workers, psychologists, and the school administrator. It's good to have a parent on the team, and then in middle or high school, consider including students. All of the research emphasizes that the principal's leadership is critical to changing school climate and culture, so they need to be seen as actively involved and leading the effort. I've included information in your support materials on how to choose your team. The next step is to take a self-assessment to see where you are, figure out what steps you need to take. I've included the tiered fidelity inventory in your support materials. Both PBIS and restorative practices embrace a strategy of preventing problem behavior and responding early to low levels of misbehavior with interventions that are effective. Together, they create this unbeatable duo. Building on the strengths of each approach, PBIS and restorative practices become stronger when blended into a seamless, integrated approach to school-wide culture, climate, discipline, and support. Thanks for attending my session. I hope you found these ideas useful for your school. If you have any questions, the conference organizers are setting up a time for us to have a live conversation, so please save your questions or comments, and I look forward to talking to you soon. You can also check out my website, lauramooiman.com, for free tools, resources, and articles. You can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram for my thoughts on my travels to schools around the world. You can find more videos on implementing restorative practices and PBIS on my YouTube channel, Laura Mooiman. And as always, keep up the good work creating the safe, positive, and restorative school that you and your students need.